Hey everybody, welcome to the PPP Thursday webinar with myself and Jack. And I'm sorry, there is no Gary today. It's his anniversary, so he chose to stay married today instead of doing the webinar with all of us. So instead, I'm going to show off my guns. Just kidding. I don't really have any, not like Gary anyway. I was not, so Gary was the youngest Mr. Kansas ever to compete. I was not the youngest Mr. Oklahoma, that I might have been the fattest. Just kidding. So anyway, this week, not a whole lot's changed. Obviously, the thing that we do know is that, no deal was reached. And Congress went on recess. Republicans are saying that the Democrats are unwilling to compromise. Democrats are saying that the Republicans are unwilling to, move up to a compromise position of, hey, we wanted $3 billion, you want $1 billion, let's split the difference at $2 billion. Hard to say what the real answer is, other than, hey, what do we know? That unemployment benefits have now expired, and that there's not a second round of PPP funding available, and President Trump implemented this unimplementable executive order, which we'll talk about today because there's been a few questions about that have come across from the FAQ section. So again, just ground rules for today. I'm going to be running it, and I'm not as good at this as Gary is. So I'm bringing up the Q&A, which we don't have any so far. But if you got a question, go ahead and put it in the Q&A. If you have a hazing comment or just want to speak to the other participants, go ahead and put that in the chat function. So with that in mind, probably we've got a few different things that I think we've seen this week that we wanted to touch on at the start that we thought would be helpful related to the things that have happened in the last week. Good morning, Joe. Things that have happened in the last week in the event that they do, hopefully pass something. So, I think the first thing we're going to touch on is the executive order associated with deferral of employee portion of payroll taxes. Again, the theoretical benefit would be, to the employee. So to the employer, there's not really a benefit. The only way the employer would receive a benefit is that if the employer was otherwise going to be reducing wages on somebody, the employee could land in the same net position, but then it creates a potential debt obligation for the employee that they may or may not be prepared for when the debt obligation comes to fruition. So it's now August 20th. The order is supposed to go in place September 1st. There's still been zero guidance from the administration on how this should be implemented. And in fact, led by the U.S. Chamber, many trade organizations have come out opposed to this mandate. So my feeling is that the odds that this is going to go somewhere, I don't know how you take back an executive order or not, but I don't see how this one's going to go somewhere. What do you think, Jack?
Yeah, so it is very interesting because there's a lot of logistics that need to go into the implementation of something like this. And what I've been reading and seeing is that first of all, there is no stated process or procedure at this point as to how this actually is going to happen, like what employers need to do necessarily. There's some speculation and some things out there, but no one has said this is from A to Z how you do this. Secondly, I've seen that some employers are saying, I'm not even gonna discuss that with my employees because I feel like they may not fully appreciate or take a shot at it and get the extra money, understanding or maybe not even understanding what that actually means. And so starting in 2021, they're going to have a double dip of these in order to pay back that deferral. And keep in mind, it is a deferral, it's not a forgiveness. And so there's discussion about that it should be a forgiveness down the road. Then you throw in the complications that, oh, well, wait a minute, what does that mean if it ends up being forgiven? Does that mean it impacts Social Security and the things that were being deferred, but now were forgiven? And so working around all those issues. I mean, the reality is, who knows when, Adam and I get to that point, since we're so young at this point, getting to there. And, is there
I don't feel it anymore, but yeah.
Yeah, right. Yeah, right there. So, or close to it. So it's all those questions that are in place, because really what the president has done is he's done what he can do within his executive power. But then you start talking about, well, who has the ability to impose tax and truly unimpose tax? It's not the president, it's the legislature. So that's why he didn't come out from the gate saying you don't have to pay it, because he doesn't have that power. He has the power to shift things around because the executive branch is in charge of the Treasury. So those are all the things that go into this. But right now, there's no roadmap. To your point, it's supposed to start September 1st. And, so what are we going to do in the next 10 days or so? Is that really going? And by the way, Congress is not in session. So small problems, right? So what?
First world problems. Well, it's all world's problem.
Right, it is. Nancy Pelosi called back the House to do certain things, but and we'll also talk about what is called the skinny version of the HEALS Act in a little bit, as to what really is going on the PPP front. But similarly, is anything really going to get done in the immediate future with the implementation of this? So I think the biggest problem is that making sure employees understand that you're just kicking the can down the road, and that expect, at least at this point, that your paycheck will be significantly less, I shouldn't say significantly, impactfully less in 2021. And so, use your money wisely now, but be aware that that's around the corner. And I think that people out of desperation will say, I'll deal with that in several months down the road, or, they're going to fix it as part of the next stimulus bill. So I think there's a lot of danger in where we're at this point. And I think a lot of employers are saying, well, I'm not going to do that until I know the rules of the road. And hopefully that it'll come down that this is not just a deferral, but rather a forgiveness.
Yeah, because, the challenge that you get into, without, going back to the provability on this, they're, being in the CPA world, Joe or Jack talked about tax liens in the back of paper for a little bit. Like, if I'm just thinking about, all right, what's my potential exposure as the employer if I let this happen? All right, so there's a special place in hell reserved for people that don't pay payroll taxes that they took on behalf of employees, and also people that don't remit sales tax that they collected from customers. Like, you can do some bad stuff in terms of not paying your income taxes, but that's like bad. I can't even say use that as a source of financing, out loud, because it's just a really, it's an awful one that can land you up, and that is something that you can go to jail for. So with that in mind, think about the documentation chain of evidence that would need to occur between now and September 1st, the first time an employee raises their hand to say that, no, I technically did deposit that money in the company's bank account. Because, right now what happens is, if you, like, same situation, right? You sign up with a payroll company, and as the employer, you pay the payroll company the trust taxes. So they're acting, you're the ultimate trust, but they're acting as a trust on your behalf. Unfortunately, there have been payroll companies that have used those trust taxes to buy houses in Palm Beach. So they took them from the client, never turned around and pay them to the IRS. So if you're the end customer and the IRS comes knocking and says, "Hey, dude, you ain't paid your payroll taxes," well, guess what? You can probably get out of the penalties and interest, but you still don't get out of the tax. You still owe it, even though you freaking paid it. It just was stolen from you. So if I'm the employer, independent of, wanting to make sure that my employees don't wind up with some debt that they weren't aware of, what I'm actually the most concerned about is that in every single other circumstance that's existed since the dawn of payroll taxes, if I paid them to somebody else and then they didn't end up in the government's pocket, I'm still on the hook. I'm not okay with that as a thing, so the clock's going to tick on September 1st. They'd have to move fast, to implement some form of guidance to say, I actually need to do something with that, as of the first, payroll run that I need to make. And I don't see it happening, especially with everything that Congress, came out with. So I think, we would say we don't know what to do with that at this point to be prepared for the eventuality. Because if you think about it, think about how awful this is in terms of not having guidance while we're getting on the soapbox. I'm only trying to kill time because we haven't had any questions yet, Jack. Think about yay, we got one. Thanks, David. Of course, you'd give me something extremely technical. You got to report your payroll 3 or 4 days before it is taken out of your bank account. So if I'm the guy that raises his hand and says, "Hey, on my September 1st check, I want my payroll taxes," that has to be a known piece of information. And how I do that days prior for it to really be effective. So it's just, it's a mess that, unless you're doing your own payroll yourself and not using a payroll company or a payroll service, I don't think it's implementable by September 1st, if it's even going to be implementable at all. So Jack, a couple of things we did want to talk about before we really kick it off into the main Q&A session. Skinny version of the HEALS Act. I don't know what we're thinking. We can't get a deal done at $1 billion versus $3 billion, compromise on $2 billion. So let's create a skinny version. What's in this one?
Yep. Well, first you lost a couple zeros there. We're talking trillions of dollars, right?
Yeah, so, sorry, trillion. Yeah,
no worries. So 1
trillion. What's a rounding error?
Exactly. Right. So the way it was characterized is the 1 trillion was the opening bid by the Republicans, and Democrats wanted it at $3.4 trillion. And then, the president basically said, "I've had enough, and I'm going to do all these things." We've talked about the fact that the Senate is, even though the House was called back for certain reasons, the Senate is out until early September. So, is really anything going to happen? You have factors like annual government funding. It will lapse or end at the end of September. So this is the fun season where we start talking about brinksmanship on budgets and funding the federal government for 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks down the road, all those, silly reindeer games that they play at this time of year. So here are a few things on that. So Pelosi and Schumer are saying that the Democrats will restart negotiations only when the administration agrees to spend $2 trillion on another round of relief. So they're kind of saying, well, they're not even going to talk until that number gets to 2 trillion, certainly not at 1 trillion, but maybe not so as high as over $3 trillion. The whole, the new kind of scuttle about the U.S. Postal Service is certainly in the mix now, not included in the Republican bill, but Democrats want to make sure that that is put into the mix. There's the $600 versus $400 versus $300 weekly federal benefit that is still in play that has not been we talked about the payroll tax, and this is where I got some of the information that there are businesses and business groups that are basically saying that we are not going to address the payroll tax issue, the deferral of it on behalf of our employees for their well-being, that they don't get hit up with this tax bill down the road. And they gave an example in this article that a worker earning $50,000 a year could face a surprise tax of about $1,100. That's in addition, that's the makeup of it, in addition to what you be paying contemporaneously at that time. So what that means is that they're deciding to continue to withhold that money on behalf of their employees. Now, whether they actually pay it, it may be that they hold on to it as long as they don't spend it. Maybe that's okay. It really isn't okay, because you have an obligation to pay it. You're as an employer, you're a trustee of the federal government in that sense. But so that's just a few things, really. Unfortunately, not a whole lot new to report, because they haven't been, at least officially, conducting business. So we just don't know where they're going to go with that. But that gives you kind of a little bit of updated perspective on where Republicans, Democrats are on the numerics and the issues that are still at hand.
Yeah. So we've had a couple calls this week with clients. I'm sure you've been the same, just talk about, all right, I think I'm ready for forgiveness. What do I do next? And at the same time, we've seen just about every bank issue guidance to its customers saying, hey, we're not even going to ask you for forgiveness yet. So I'm not going to go into the reasons to delay for tax purposes again, because I think we've well covered that you should delay until they resolve the taxability, unless you have a good reason not to. But I think Aquesta was the only bank that I'd heard of that had accepted an application yet. I don't know if that was really tentative or not on their part, but what I found interesting was in the whole, I think our guidance on this call has been, you're either 8 weeks or you're 24 weeks. There's not really a middle ground, because they haven't issued guidance on how do you prorate for 12 weeks or 13 weeks or 14 weeks, because there's nowhere to specify what your proration period is when you do that certification around how much you paid people. So you don't really know, is it $15,000? Is it $20,000? Is it $45,000 that I'm using for the amount to compare against, even though the subsequent guidance and legislation has said, hey, when you're ready, submit the application. There's no guidance on the proration mechanism or how you'll know that and do that correctly. So that just seems like one of those things that's, fraught for fraud, meaning, I'm going to say 13 weeks and submit it 13 weeks so that I can get away with not having to do something on the FT counter, just something like that. It seems bad. Anyway, banks seem to be slow playing applications. What are your thoughts on that, Jack, in terms of what's going on with that?
Yeah, so interesting. We've been talking about in prior discussions about the applicant's perspective, but I found some interesting reading, and it was kind of like an aggregation discussion about why are the banks not processing these applications. And first of all, it's not all banks. Some banks are aggressively and assertively putting their their applications into the system. But so just to give you again perspective, this article reports that it was 5.2 million PPP loans for more than $525 billion before the portal closed. And so in summary of some of these reasons is that the bankers or the banks are waiting to see if there is this blanket automatic forgiveness of loans under a certain amount, like the 150 that we've been talking, $150,000. So obviously if that goes into play, then they don't have to spend the time and effort and personnel in processing this stuff, even though a lot of it's automated, that there is obviously some human contact in there. Others, and I hadn't really thought about this until I read this article, is that banks are selling off their PPP portfolios to others. They're like, you know what, we're done with this. We're going to sell it off. Don't know the financials behind that. Is it at a discount? Is it at some sort of margin? I would imagine it's a discount because it usually is when you sell groups of stuff like that. But so that's another reason. And then apparently some banks are outsourcing the forgiveness process. So they're hiring outside people to hire guns to run this process for the bank. And in most of those cases, you don't know that. You just, it's someone they hired, and everything that you see says ABC Bank, B of A, Wells, whatever it is. You don't know that it's been outsourced. So, and as I said, there are banks, and they cited some banks in San Diego and other places that are are accepting applications. So there's a couple different points, right? You put it in, are they going to accept it? And then what do they do with it? Does it stay in some sort of bank purgatory, loan purgatory, or does it actually get pushed to where it needs to go to begin that process? And there's a lot of ambiguity and uncertainty as to where that is, even though a bank may say, yes, we're processing the forgiveness applications. What does that mean? I mean, they can swim around in the ambiguity of processing, and if they don't tell you, yes, we are submitting it as soon as we get it or within 10 days, if there's not specificity like that, who knows what they're really doing with that application in the background. So I just thought it was interesting to share the aggregation of those perspectives as to the possible reasons why the banks are not. I mean, some of them are obvious, but some of the other ones I hadn't really thought about.
Yeah. So as people are kind of evaluating whether or not to send people back to work or not at this point, we've seen, people going to college and then college is shutting down, now that there's been a mass return of people. What are some of the risks you guys are getting asked about? Part of what the Republicans really wanted was some sort of blanket liability protection for employers. What are the concerns that you're seeing out there for companies, Jack?
Yeah, so there was, I'm a member of the International Franchise Association, so I think many on this call know I'm an M&A lawyer, business lawyer, but I have a franchise practice. And so I get information from that resource, and it's all over it's focused on franchising, but it deals with employment law issues, obviously. And so they published they did a survey, and their survey, and again, this is maybe stating the obvious, but it was the top 5 employment law risks due to COVID-19. It was published a few days ago. And so the biggest, number 1, was failure to safeguard the workplace. So basically not setting up the actual facility properly when you're saying, hey, come back to work. And some people who have to come back to work have no choice but to go into the environment that's provided to them. So they're saying that there have been OSHA claims, so pretty significant health, safety, health issues, and then lawsuits for alleged wrongful death and other injuries for allegedly intentional conduct that led to the exposure. Now, the word intentional is an interesting word because it means the opposite many times of accidental or inadvertent. So intentional could mean acts of commission and acts of omission. If you intentionally decide not to do something, that's intention. Okay. If you intend not to provide a safe work environment, and that can be attributed to you making a decision versus not realizing that there was maybe a point of exposure that you hadn't thought about, that there was some air venting from another part of the building that was vented that wasn't properly filtered and everything else was filtered. And you told your employees, we have the industrial hospital strength filters on our filtration system, on our HVAC, those kind of things, maybe not intentional. So there's that issue. The number 2 is failure to properly pay employees. So we have this whole new way of doing things, of teleworking. So you have expectations of what people are doing on the job when you can't physically see them. But they are still entitled to, if they were entitled to previously, lunch breaks, other breaks, all those things that if they were physically in your office, that they're still entitled to. Now, if they choose to not do that, like if they choose not to take, if they choose to work 45 hours instead of 40, and you didn't, or 37 and a half, that you didn't authorize that, it's not necessarily, and I'm saying not necessarily, and this is not legal advice, this is, because I don't know your own situation and whether they're salaried, exempt or not. So, you didn't authorize that overtime. So are they entitled to that? It may be that they want, in their own mind, are banking time, working hard today so they can maybe take some time off tomorrow to get stuff done. So there's that issue. Number 3 is failure to accommodate.
Can we back up on that one, Jack? I mean, we've had real world client scenarios where, you take right now, it's like, look, if you've got little kids at home and you're trying to do the homeschooling right now, it's tough to do that. At the same time, some of these same hourly employees are logging overtime. It's like, how's it even physically possible that you could be logging overtime? Because it seems like you're probably a captive person for at least 5 hours during the day, with dealing with CMS. So it is fraught with problems. And the way the overtime rules read is, it's not like it's a large body of time that you're doing the evaluation on. I think from what I remember, each week stands on its own.
Yep.
So.
And another interesting concept is, we were talking about teleworking, but there was an example in somewhere that I read that if there is a queue, a line to get a temperature check, to get through a barrier, to get to your workspace, you're on the clock at that point. It's not like, okay, well, you kind of show up, you put your lunch in the fridge, and then you kind of start your day at 8:30. So you show up at 8:20 to get all that stuff done, because we're not going to pay you for your preparation for work. But if you are causing a delay in that person getting to their workspace by getting 6 feet apart in a line to check in, that's apparently compensation or compensable work. And so we don't think about those kind of things. It's like, okay, well, you don't start your workday until you actually get to your workspace. So it's stuff like that is interesting. The number 3 on the list, as I said, failure to accommodate high risk workers. Right now, it's my understanding that COVID in and of itself does not fall under ADA issues, but it's ADA-like. And so I think what you're going to find is that there are going to be ADA-related complaints and other issues with respect to workers that are at high risk, and you don't accommodate that. Now, there's always the level of what is a reasonable accommodation. So it's not like you have to go exhaust everything on behalf of an employee. For example, we have an employee that has compromised immunity. And so she made a very difficult decision that for her, even with all the things that we're doing a lot in my office, that it just wasn't a safe environment, particularly going to and from the workspace, from the parking deck to our office, in the elevators, even though the building's doing certain things. So, but we did go a few extra miles for her in the interim before she made that decision that were specifically for her, knowing that she had this issue. So there's those things to deal with. And then failure to comply with the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. So, interference with rights and retaliation. So someone asks you as employer, asks you for accommodation, and then not only do you not do it, but you retaliate against them for whatever reason. And there's all kinds of forms of retaliation. And then failure to properly conduct layoffs and reinstatements was number 5 on their survey. And that some examples they gave are the ones that you think about, which is you think about under normal circumstances, but you may not think about the numbers as you're going through this process of layoffs. So if there is a disproportionate, whether it's intentional or non-intentional, disproportionate layoff and it can be traced back race, gender, disability, all those things that are legally protected. And that you can say all that you want that it was not intentional, but you don't necessarily, you look at the intention, but you also look at the outcome. And you have a responsibility as an employer to prevent certain outcomes in certain circumstances. So those are some things that have been in the forefront in the legal world with respect to employment practices, employer-employee relationships.
And then I think the other thing that I've seen out there too is, we've had some clients that, when we're checking in to see, hey, how are things trending in terms of, the last 6 months, and then, maybe getting back to a new normal or some sense of normalcy. One of the things that's come up is that, they either had customers cancel or they're worried about customers canceling or not paying them due to force majeure language in different contracts. So what have you seen on the whole force majeure business interruption side of the world?
Sure. So two things, starting on the business interruption. So, the theory is how can insureds get coverage for the impact, the interruption to their business? Most business interruption policies require some sort of physical damage. Somebody had a heart attack and their car came screaming through the front window of your business, and it created structural damage, and so you are out of business. That's what that's for. Then you have key man insurance and other things, but there is going to be difficulty in bringing those two worlds together, meaning coverage when there hasn't been a physical damage that is required according to the policy. There is a organization called the Business Interruption Group, and you can find it online. And I'm not an advocate, I'm not a paid spokesman or anything like that. I just happen to know that some of my clients, particularly in the hospitality industry, are looking into it and possibly getting involved with it, maybe in the background. And there are obviously some leaders that are at the forefront of this effort, but trying to find ways through legislation or otherwise to force insurance companies' hands in covering this. I have my own perception as to whether that's going to be successful or not. And I think it's a long uphill climb to get to that point. What would have to happen is legislatures would say, as a matter of public policy, we are going to force private entities, insurance companies, to cover something that was not put forth in the writing of an insurance policy. We're basically going to modify the terms of a contract between the insurance company and the insured and force insurance companies to give money. Now, again, I'm not an advocate either way. Obviously, I'm more of an advocate for the businesses to be able to get insured and get the insurance money and move on. But I just think that is a really, it's going to be very difficult to get to that point. On the force majeure, that's interesting in a sense that if you're looking at it from the perspective of that it was the disease, the virus that caused the problem, then you have to link it to something, well, it's an act of God. And then, okay, is it really an act of God? Because, the president said people in China created this monster, right? And so you get into those issues. The next level is, well, the underlying cause may be the virus, but when the government, the federal and state government, local government, start saying, you have to close your business, you have to do certain things, you have to follow certain guidelines, and they are imposing things on you. Now you have a compensable event, and I don't mean necessarily monetary compensation, but has it triggered whatever the effect of the force majeure if it were to occur according to that contract? And not all force majeure provisions are the same. with respect to what is defined as a force majeure, nor what the effect of a force majeure event as defined in the agreement will be. Is it that the parties are able to delay their performance, whether it's actually performing, delivering goods, performing services, and on the other side, payment for those goods and services? Or is it that, is it a short-term delay? Is it an indefinite delay? Is it potentially a way to terminate the contract without liability to the other? So there's all kinds of things like that. But it goes back to, has there been a sufficient trigger to that force majeure clause? And still to be interpreted whether it falls under act of God, whether it's some sort of government imposed restriction that caused it. So I think that our litigators and other litigators will be very busy in the contractual enforcement and damages space. General contracts, leases, many leases have force majeure clauses. So, does that somehow impact obligations of the tenant to pay? Does it impact obligations on the landlord to do certain things like fix the parking lot when it's broken up? I mean, so all kinds of potential implications, but it's a big unknown at this point as to how all that is going to turn out. There have been a few test cases, at least on the business insurance side, actually on both. And so far, the insured and the person trying to use the force majeure clause as a defense to enforcement of the contract have failed. I shouldn't say categorically, because I only see bits and pieces, but at this point, I have not heard of or seen where that person in that position wins the day with the insurance or with the force majeure clause.
Got it. Well, thanks, Jack. I think it was Melanie, you had raised your hand. I'm not smart enough to figure out how to answer a question that way. So if you want to type in your question to Q&A, if you still have it, that'd be great. But so far, we just got one question. This is from David. The main PPP safe harbor that allows you to use the easy form says you made no change to staff or hours between January 1st and the end of your covered period. Do you think the word between means that where you ended up now is the same as where you started, or that no changes were ever made during the period? In other words, if I laid people in March, but brought them all back by my cover period, do I qualify for the easy form? The answer to that, I think based on my interpretation, David, is yes and no. So the first part of the question is, do you think the word between means that where you ended up now is the same as where you started? I think to that extent, the answer is yes on the easy form, but the specificity of landed the same would be the average FTE count. So, if I let a person go and then I hired a person their spot, and based on my FTE calculation of average FTEs, I ended up even Stevens, I think I'm good to go on the easy form, because that's really the definition of I didn't really make any changes and I didn't cut anybody's pay. Everything else is an exception, which is the safe harbor piece, meaning that, look, I didn't meet the average FTE test, but I hired everybody back. Therefore, the safe harbor provision applies. So I think the answer to your question is that if your average FTE counts are the same, it doesn't matter how you got there. But if they're not, you're qualifying for an exception, and that's where you're checking one of those boxes and showing how you got that exception. Wow, I'm learning how to use this, Jack. There we go.
All right.
So that was our one big question. Does anybody else have anything out there today? If not, it may be that we've got some stomachs rumbling. Everybody's at lunch. All right. Well,
I guess I'll just say that, hopefully we'll find out more. I mean, it's always, we just never know day to day, week to week, what will come up. But I think my expectation and anticipation is that, I don't know, in a sense that there's a lot of pressure on our legislators to get something done. But and businesses are bleeding, people are bleeding. And you would think that they would say, oh yeah, I'm going to cut my time away off and get to this point. The problem is that you have both sides playing a brinksmanship game and saying, like, so example, the quote that I've read to you before that Nancy Pelosi and Schumer say, we're not even going to start talking until that 1 trillion, that there's a 2 in front of that number instead of a 1. And so, that kind of stuff, instead of being more cooperative, and I'm not political, I'm not assessing blame. I'm just saying that, there needs to be cooperation to get this through, and, making statements that, don't even bother us until a 2 shows up in front of that number, I think is a bad idea. On the other end, it is, okay, well, we're not gonna, we're not going to the Republicans are saying, well, we're not going to discuss things with you until you do certain things. And so I think it is incumbent upon all of us to continue to put pressure on those legislators to get stuff done and let them know how unhappy we are, not necessarily with them, but just with what's going on, to put a lot of peer pressure on them to get stuff done. And so imagine if they don't come back for another couple of weeks to just initiate the discussions, if they drop their brinksmanship attitudes. And I think it has been amazing in some instances how fast things have happened between point A and point B, but then you look at other points in time where it's like, what are these people doing? And we elected them, they are representing us. And I'm sorry if you have to burn the midnight oil, but just get it done. However, and again, not defensive, but we're a couple weeks away from an election, not the presidential election, but other elections. And so people are in self-preservation mode as to, well, yeah, I got to deal with all this other stuff. And if I don't, I may lose the election, but I have to do all those other things I normally would be doing to get reelected. So they're distracted. Again, not being defensive, but there's just a lot of stuff going on. And I just think we need to keep putting pressure on all of our representatives as much as possible.
Yeah. Thanks, Jack. So David asked a follow-up question. So if I laid people off for 6 weeks, then I have to use the long form. That's my current take, David. If I'm wrong on that, then I'll address it in the next webinar. But that's my current take, because the easy form was really around, it's easy. I didn't have any changes. I think the long form was meant to say, hey, I had some changes, but here's my support for why I qualify for the exception.
And I would agree with that. I don't know the actual answer, but just in theory, the easy form, like in your 1040 easy, is meant to streamline the process where you don't have all these variables and where you don't need to provide accountability and transparency because there's nothing to report as being diversions from getting from point A to point B. So, I don't know that answer for sure, but that just seems like it. Yes, unfortunately, you got to go through that because they want to, the people that, I guess, let me put it this way. There is possibility that people will try to use the easy form and try to slip that through when they have reportable items. And so if, even though the numbers ended up being where you were supposed to be, and in theory, you might have been able to use the easy form under other circumstances, it just potentially creates a possible red flag for them in their system. And so, maybe it's worth going through a little bit of the extra effort and filling out the longer form, because it isn't, the difference between a 1040 and 1040 easy is much more significant, I think, from what I've seen, than the easy form, the PPP forgiveness easy form, between the two versions, the long and the short form.
Any other questions out there, guys? All right. So hopefully something will happen in the next week, and we'll either have some guidance on payroll deferrals or, something, or we'll just be having fun. I'll actually be on PTO next week, but I'll be here, but I'll try to get a shot from, we're choosing this as the opportunity that if the kids have to be in school, they can be at the school at the beach. So we will be in Florida. Yes, David, PTO again. Um, we'll be in Florida watching the sunset on the West Coast while doing webinars. So y'all have a great, safe week out there. And thanks for having us again. And hopefully we've got some changes to talk about next week.
Make sure everybody tells Gary how wonderful job we did. I mean, make him feel like, yeah, we really missed you and it could have been just a little bit better, but that we didn't screw
But not really. See you guys.
Bye.
All right.